September 12, 1944. When Major Robert Cowboy Stout entered the cockpit of his F-6F Hellcat aboard the USS Hornet at 8 a.m., the Pacific sun was already fierce. There was orderly anarchy on the carrier deck. The incessant sound of engines warming up for the day's sorties, the smell of aviation fuel mingling with salt air, and the scurrying of deck staff in colored jerseys between planes. By now, Stout had flown 63 combat missions, but this morning seemed different. The previous evening's intelligence briefings had been ambiguous, bordering on contemptuous. Plu, a patch of jungle and coral in the Palau Islands that the majority of Americans had never heard of, was the target. 15,000 Marines would storm in 3 days those beaches in a brief 3-day operation, as commanders had promised. It would take 2 months and result in around 10,000 casualties. Spoiler alert. Stout was unaware of that, though. On paper, his mission was straightforward. Fly over the airfields in the north for reconnaissance, take some pictures, and report back. The brass had to attest to the fact that there was not much Japanese air power in the area. The airfields have been described as deserted or weakly fortified by previous reconnaissance aircraft. Basically, Stout's role was to check a box before the invasion began. He had already completed dozens of these milk trips. Dull, monotonous, and the type of assignment where dozing off at the stick posed the greatest risk. On the lengthy flight home, the intelligence was disastrously incorrect this time, though. Stout started his routine picture-run procedure as his Hellcat, which was flying at 8,000 feet, approached Plu from the east. As he flew level and straight over the target region, the camera behind his cockpit would automatically take overlapping pictures. At that moment, he saw it, a sight that instantly sent his tactical mind into overdrive and chilled his blood. There was no abandonment of the airfield. It was crowded, like sardines in a can. Japanese planes were arranged in rows on the tarmac, wingtip to wingtip. Mitsubishi, those agile combatants who had dominated the early fighting, were A6M0. Aichi D-3A dive bombers and Nakajima, the B-5, and torpedo bombers were armed, fueled, and prepared to destroy the invading fleet that was speeding into Plu at the time. Stout tallied rapidly. He was able to quickly assess aircraft density according to his war expertise. There are at least 40 planes, if not more, hidden beneath camouflage netting close to the edge of the jungle. This defensive force wasn't merely symbolic. Just across the horizon, this strike force was poised and prepared to execute a devastating attack on the American ships. Those aircraft would rip apart the defenseless transport ships transporting Marines if they managed to get airborne during the invasion. In the ocean, thousands of men would perish before they ever touched the shore. The whole thing might go apart, turning Tarawa into a bloodfest that would resemble a drill. His radio was filled with the steady, businesslike check-ins of other pilots in the vicinity. Hovering over the transmit button was Stout's thumb. He was required by protocol to notify this right away, break off, and allow the fleet to assemble a suitable strike package. However, he persuaded doubtful intelligence authorities that they had overlooked a complete air base by the time he returned by plane, filed a report, and filed it. Valuable time would burn off. These planes would be scattered, concealed in revetments, or worse, launched against the fleet by the Japanese. They were sitting ducks right now, totally exposed, most likely awaiting morning reconnaissance to verify the assault fleet's location before attacking. In order to have a better view, Stout made another pass, this time descending to 3,000 feet. Despite his fighter pilot instincts, screaming warnings about anti-aircraft sites, his photographer's eyes were recording every detail. The airfield stretched along the northern shore of Plu and featured a single runway composed of coral and vegetation. Zones of dispersal spreading out on either side. He was more interested in the arrangement of the planes than in their quantity. A deadly error had been made by someone on the ground, most likely motivated by the pressing need to be ready for their own strike mission. The airplanes were parked with only 15 feet between each other in close, tidy rows. They would normally be dispersed, concealed by trees, and shielded by revetments. Rather, they appeared to be waiting in line for flight school's inspection day. Stout was able to observe ground personnel via his canopy traveling from one aircraft to another. Small individuals wearing khaki uniforms were lugging ammunition belts, moving gasoline drums, and conducting pre-flight inspections. The fact that an American jet was hovering over them was unknown to them. Why would they? In this area, Japanese early warning radar was at best rudimentary, and reconnaissance flights by a single aircraft were frequent enough that they hardly ever resulted in a complete alarm. Even from 3,000 feet above the ground, the complacency was obvious. This morning, these teams believed they controlled the sky. They believed they had time. Stout was working feverishly on his tactical analysis. He had received ground attack training at Pensacola, practiced strafing runs on target sleds for weeks, and painted hulks of trucks. The doctrine was simple. Arrive quickly and low, make a single devastating pass to your target, and then flee before ground fire can follow you. However, doctrine expected that you would be hitting a single target rather than a whole air base. 3 650 caliber machine guns per side, each with 400 rounds, were mounted in the wings of his Hellcat. That gave him a total of 2,400 rounds. Additionally, he could fire continuously for roughly 12 seconds before running out of ammunition at the Browning M2 cyclic rate of 750 rounds per minute. 40 planes can be destroyed in 12 seconds. In a traditional sense, the arithmetic didn't work. However, the more he looked at the arrangement, the more he understood that the norm wasn't applicable. Those planes weren't only parked near one another. Their fuel supply were parked next to them. He could make out the drums next to each aircraft, which were most likely high-octane aviation fuel that was ready to be put into tanks for the dawn strike. A single tracer round would transform a gasoline drum into a bomb. An aircraft in flames would spread to nearby aircraft. A huge chain reaction was unintentionally set in motion by the Japanese. Shooting down 40 planes one at a time was not the goal here. The idea was to light a fuse and let thermodynamics handle the rest. He made sure he had enough fuel in his gauge for both the strike and the return flight. All 6 of his firearms had full loads, according to his ammo counter. Under him, the Hellcat felt stable, responsive, and prepared. He had flown 63 missions in this aircraft. Like a devoted horse, he trusted it. However, trust did not make risk go away. There were Japanese anti-aircraft positions waiting somewhere in the bush around the airfield. 25mm Autok guns of Type 96. Likely the Japanese inventory's standard light AA weapon. Fingers on triggers, they would be looking up into the sky. After he made, every gun post on the island would light him up as those machine guns began to boom during his initial flyby. Without a wingman to cover him or a rescue in case he went down, he would be flying into a storm of steel by himself and without assistance. In Stout's mind, the decision point became crystal clear. Every moment he circled was an additional moment the planes were poised to murder U.S. Marines and sailors. He might wait for orders, radio back to the carrier, and observe the organization of a legitimate strike package. The entire synchronized ballet of naval aviation, including dive bombers and cap fighters. That would take at least 90 minutes, most likely 2. Hours spent on launch sequences and briefings. Japanese spotters would have reported the location of the assault fleet by that point. Those 40 planes would be in the air, hunting, dispersed. The opportunity window would permanently close. There were legitimate reasons for military doctrine to exist. Coordination prevented fatalities. Overwhelming force reduced danger. Disasters were avoided via careful planning. Stout had attended all the flight school courses and learned the importance of never interacting with people without assistance. However, doctrine was also unable to explain every circumstance. Occasionally, war handed you a moment that existed outside the rule book, a convergence of circumstances that would never repeat. That time came now. 40 enemy planes, crammed together like bullets in a magazine, were utterly defenseless and, if unharmed, could radically alter the trajectory of the Plu invasion. And one American pilot, who knows how to operate a loaded Hellcat. Stout's logical side of the brain listed all the possibilities that things may go horribly wrong. On the first pass, anti-aircraft fire might destroy his Hellcat, sending him flying into the bush in a flaming ball. His hydraulic connections could be severed with a fortunate shot, preventing him from managing the aircraft. His weapons might jam. Even with the trustworthy Brownings, It occurred, particularly in the wet Pacific air. During the attack run, he can mistake his altitude and crash into ground at 300 miles per hour. Any of these consequences would result in a solitary death on an unnamed island. He never fully recovered. His family is assumed dead after getting a telegram with the antiseptic phrase "missing in combat." However, the opposite side of that equation was just as obvious. American transport ships would be destroyed if those Japanese aircraft carried out their attack. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers would hit the sluggish, precarious ships transporting Marines and their gear, turning them into floating coffins. Bombers. Stout had witnessed ships explode and drown while hundreds of soldiers were trapped below decks, as well as action film from past invasions. He had overheard pilots arriving too late to halt attacks talking over the radio. Their voices were filled with desperation as they saw ships sink. This isn't the place for it. Not when he could have stopped it. Not when 40 enemy planes were positioned like targets on a practice range beneath him. Additionally, there was something else that was impossible to ignore, but more difficult to measure: the overall tactical opportunity. Stout had never seen hostile aircraft this well on 63 combat sorties, set up for devastation. Desperate dog battles at altitude, fuel burning, chasing elusive Zeros through clouds, or hitting well-defended sites with little success were the main modes of air combat in the Pacific. This was unique. This was the kind of opportunity that pilots spoke about in ready rooms but never really experienced, and it was every fighter pilot's dream. War was about taking advantage of enemy errors before they could be fixed, and the Japanese had committed a grave operational error. Stout pushed the throttle forward with his hand. The Pratt & Whitney engine of the Hellcat roared back with a deep throat, 18 cylinders producing, 2,000 horsepower. He started to descend by nosing the plane down. No more reconnaissance orbits, no more radio calls. The choice was made. He would either become a legend or a statistic in 30 seconds. In any case, the invasion fleet was not going to be attacked by those Japanese aircraft. He would do whatever it took to ensure that. Similar to a hawk finding prey, the Hellcat fell. Unwinding across 2,000 feet, 1,500 feet, is Stout's limiter. At 50 feet over the treetops, he leveled off, so low that his prop wash caused palm fronds to whip. Right, he was now above most radar coverage in terms of altitude, and within the envelope, where anti-aircraft gunners found it difficult to follow swiftly moving targets. He had about 3 seconds to complete the geometry of his attack before the airfield raced for him. The Japanese planes were positioned parallel to the runway in rows that ran from northeast to southwest. Instead of following a single road down its length, Stout would be crossing many lines of aircraft in a single pass, since he had arranged his approach perpendicular to those rows. More targets in his cone of fire meant more opportunities to start the domino effect he was hoping for. 310 miles per hour was displayed on his airspeed indicator as he cleared the last line of jungle. Before him, the airfield spread out like a shooting gallery. He was able to perceive certain details with striking clarity all of a sudden. Ground crew workers' faces were briefly visible as they looked up in bewilderment before recognition gave way to fear. Each airplane has 3 high fuel drums next to it, an engine cowling open on a Zero. The maintenance is still ongoing. Stout's thumb located his control stick's fire button. In order to create a destructive cone of fire that would rip through anything in its path, the 650 caliber Brownings were synchronized to converge at a point 300 yards ahead. Each gun fired incendiary rounds that penetrated armor rounds combined with regular ball ammo, a mixture intended to ignite fuel systems and pierce aircraft skin. He hit the button. When all 6 guns fired at once, the Hellcat trembled. The sound was 1,000 times louder than tearing canvas. In order for pilots to walk their fire into target, tracers arched out from his wings in blazing streams, flaming red-hot every 5th round. Stout targeted the space between 2 Zeros, where he could see a cluster of gasoline drums, in the first row of the aircraft. After kicking up white dust as they moved across the coral tarmac, the 50 caliber rounds were sewn into the fuselage of the first aircraft. The bombardment caused the metal skin to peel away like tissue paper. He held the trigger down for 2 complete seconds, firing roughly 25 rounds per gun for a total of 150 bullets. He then moved his aim slightly to the left. Not all the fuel barrels burst at once, but rather in a coordinated cascade. An orange fireball burst from the first drum, instantly spreading to its nearby companions. Aviation fuel with a high octane rating does more than simply burn. When atomized and heated, it explodes, generating overpressure waves that travel through vapor. The Zero's wing tank, which had most likely been filled up for plane attack that morning, was caught in the explosion. The combatant vanished in a secondary explosion that sprayed two nearby aircraft with burning gasoline. Stout had already passed them, his tracers locating the next row and slamming into the swollen fuselage of a Nakajima torpedo bomber. This aircraft could launch long-range attacks against ships since it was larger, heavier, and completely loaded with fuel. Stout felt the shockwave buffet his Hellcat as he sped past at 300 miles per hour because the boom was so strong when it went up. He was now almost halfway across the airfield. For seconds into his sprint, the speed at which fires were spreading was frightening. These planes were parked so close by the Japanese that burning fuel from a neighbor that was pulled beneath it. Aluminum used in aircraft melts at 1,220 degrees Fahrenheit. At 2,500 degrees, Agals burns. Even before flames reached the wing tanks, they were bursting from thermal stress, releasing hundreds of gallons of fuel that instantaneously flash-ignited. Most ground crew personnel were merely running for their life, but some were attempting to get to fire apparatus. Positions against planes were beginning to respond. They were firing aimlessly, following smoke and confusion instead of the Hellcat that had already blasted past their fields of fire, but they were winking from concealed positions close to the runway. Stout continued to fire shots across the third while keeping his finger on the trigger, and parked planes in the fourth and fifth rows. His fire was absorbed by a line of dive bombers, whose thin aluminum skins offered no defense against armor-piercing bullets of .50 caliber. Ordnance was still loaded in one of them. In the split second before his tracers discovered them, he saw a glimpse of bombs draped beneath the wings. It was a devastating explosion. A huge explosion that caused a mushroom cloud of black smoke to rise. In an eye-link, the bomb shrapnel transformed the immaculate fighters into twisted metal sculptures by shredding two nearby Zeros like a massive shotgun blast. Debris pattered against the shockwave because it was so intense. The canopy of Stout, the strengthened glass, was pinging with tiny pieces of aircraft. The whole airfield was turning into a living horror. An uncontrollable conflict had developed from what had begun as surgical strikes on fuel barrels. Through puddles of burning gasoline that ran across the tarmac and followed the runway's small gradient, fire was leaping from plane to aircraft and spreading. As ammo cooked off inside burning planes, secondary explosions were occurring every few seconds. 20mm cannon shells, machine gun rounds of combatants, and even some of the smaller as yet unloaded bombs. Every blast fueled the turmoil, causing more fires, more shrapnel, and more damage. The type of smoke that could be seen from the carrier task force 50 miles away was now rising in thick, black columns. Between the forest and the flaming airplane were ground crew personnel who had been doing maintenance. As he roared past, Stout saw glimmers of them in his peripheral vision. Men jumping into drainage ditches, others wearing coats to be at flames, and hopeless attempts to save already doomed aircraft. The bombers were being serviced by a gasoline truck that took as fire erupted and detonated with enough force to topple it over, spilling thousands more gallons of high-octane fuel into the fire. Even at 300 miles per hour, Stout could feel the heat in his cockpit, a surge of thermal energy that warped his perception of the targets in front of him and caused the air to shimmer. He was rapidly running out of ammunition counters. In that single devastating pass, he had burned up around 1,200 rounds over all 6 guns, or approximately half of his load. But the destruction was increasing beyond what he could have accomplished with a few gunshots. Vulnerability had been exacerbated by the Japanese. Concentrated fuel supply, closely spaced aircraft, limited fire suppression tools, and likely little ground crew training on catastrophe response. For them, everything that could go wrong was going wrong, and Stout was the trigger that started it all. He climbed to 500 feet to evaluate the damage and make plans for his next move after pulling up abruptly at the end of the airstrip. Now the anti-aircraft fire was getting more intense. 25 black as the gunners at last gained range. Puffs of millimeter shells erupted around his plane. He had to maneuver through a web of fire created by tracers from light machine guns that were firing up from various places. The Japanese were shooting at anything that moved in a frenzy, but their accuracy was appalling. Their purpose was being ruined by smoke and fear. As he assessed his accomplishments, Stout banked sharply right, utilizing his altitude advantage to avoid being inside the envelope of the most intense ground fire. The airfield's northern portion was totally consumed. At least 15 planes were reduced to charcoal skeletons of their former selves and were either burning or already destroyed. However, the targets in the southern part were still intact. He counted another 20 to 25 planes that hadn't been on his first pass. Moved. Desperate ground crews were already moving some of them in an attempt to taxi them away from the fires, which was a mistake because it made immobile targets more mobile and therefore more vulnerable, but also more difficult to attack. Behind his oxygen mask, Stout smiled. They were simplifying his work. He lined up for his second run by pushing the stick forward. Stout was aware that the second pass would be different. A fully aware adversary who had witnessed the initial attack turn their airstrip into a cremation had taken the place of the element of surprise. Now he was being tracked by all Plu's anti-aircraft guns. In a panic, crews were turning elevation wheels and directing his flying course. Another aspect was the smoke. Thousands of feet of thick black columns obscured targets and caused turbulence, making precision flight all but impossible. However, the threat posed by the remaining aircraft from the southern dispersion region was equal to that of the burning ones. He was unable to keep them whole. This time, he approached from the southeast rather than going back the way he had come in. Simple survival strategies. Because gunners can predict your next move, you should never use the same offensive pattern twice. Although his somewhat reduced airspeed, around 280 miles per hour, improved his target resolution, also increased his susceptibility to ground fire. It was an essential trade-off. Everything had been a blur at 310 miles per hour. He could choose precise targets and make every round matter at 280. The situation with his ammunition was becoming dire. He might have 800 bullets left in all 6 weapons, which would have allowed him to fire for roughly 6 seconds if he kept the trigger down. A minor display of death was the anti-aircraft fire. His flight route was crisscrossed by tracers, some of whom came near enough for him to see the blazing projectile speeding by his canopy. 30 feet to his left, a 25 millimeters round exploded, near enough that his fuselage was rocked by shrapnel. Ahead, another burst, requiring him to right, ruining his objective for a single valuable second. The Japanese gunners were improving. They were putting up kill boxes for him to fly through and adjusting to his speed and altitude. It was Stout's training. Never stay in a straight line for longer than 2 seconds. Be altering things all the time. It is impossible to anticipate your altitude, heading, or speed. Ground workers were frantically attempting to taxi toward the bush when he opened fire on a group of 5 Zeros. The lead aircraft was discovered by his tracers raking it from propeller to tail. The pilot was frantically escaping the flaming cockpit, his flight suit already on fire as the Zero's fuel tank exploded. The plane turned into another torch as it rolled to a halt. Robust, changed aim, pounded shots into its engine, and caught the second Zero as it attempted to swing away. Sprayed a white mist of coolant. The jet shuddered to a stop as the engine seized. 2 more combatants in the group were eliminated by 3 additional blasts. Before a fortunate shot from Stout's final rounds punctured something essential, and it nosed over into the jungle. Out of commission, if not destroyed, the 5th Zero made it to the Trian. His port side cannons clicked empty. The trio of left-wing Brownings had exhausted themselves. With perhaps 300 rounds left in his starboard cannons, the asymmetric firepower made aiming difficult. More difficult. The uneven recoil made the Hellcat desire to pull to the left. By applying additional rudder pressure, he was able to find more targets. 2 dive bombers, most likely equipped for an attack, were seated close to a camouflage revetment. He punched holes in the cockpits and fuel cells of both airplanes while walking his remaining tracers. One was instantly on fire, until the neighbor's expanding flames reached a puddle and both aircraft went up together in a thrilling double explosion. The other just sat there leaking gasoline. Something struck the tail portion of his Hellcat, a strong blow that caused the entire airplane to shudder. Stout glanced at his instrument panel, looking for any falling gauge needles or red lights. Oil pressure remaining constant. Nominal hydraulic control surfaces are still operational. Although nothing important had been broken by whatever had struck him, it served as a reminder that his good fortune was not permanent. The likelihood that a Japanese was going to get lucky and place a shell somewhere his Hellcat couldn't absorb rose with each second he spent over this airfield. After watching a gasoline truck close to the runway burn into flames with his final burst, he pulled up hard and made his way for the open ocean, now that his starboard guns were dry as well. Over the course of 2 runs, all 2,400 bullets used up about 15 seconds of real trigger time. The Plough airfield was fading behind him. As he ascended to safer altitude, Stout took the chance to glance back over his shoulder, and the image was so complete it was almost unbelievable. The whole northern part was afire. A single enormous pillar, rising more than 10,000 feet into the tropical sky, was formed by the merging of columns of black smoke. It wasn't much better in the south. On his second pass, he attacked almost all the aircraft, and their smoke added to the apocalyptic sight, as they were either crippled or burning. Starting at 5, the heat shimmer could be seen miles away, warping the air above the runway like a mirage. Ground crews were just trying to survive, avoiding the munitions that kept cooking off in sporadic staccato spurts, and had given up on any pretense of battling the fires. The tactical ramifications were overwhelming, and as Stout's adrenaline started to level down, his focus turned from urgent survival to strategic evaluation. About 8 minutes of action destroyed or rendered unusable 40 Japanese aircraft. That strike wasn't merely a success. It involved the total abolition of Japanese air power in the Plough region. The Japanese Navy had intended to respond to the American attack with those planes. Invasion. The Japanese garrison on Plough was blind and helpless against air attacks without them. 3 days later, on September 15th, the Marines would land with complete air superiority as soon as their landing craft touched down on the beach. The arithmetic was straightforward yet hard. A transport ship could have been destroyed or seriously damaged by any of the torpedo bombers. Additionally, each transport held about 1/500 Marines along with their gear. Even half of those 40 planes could have launched a coordinated attack that would have destroyed the invasion fleet and turned the shallow waters around Plough into a cemetery. Stout possessed, avoided that terrible situation on their own. His name would be unknown to the Marines who would storm those beaches, would be alive despite not realizing that their unopposed landing was made possible by a single pilot's choice to assault a whole air base. That was the war calculus. Invisible cause and effect chains in which a single person's deeds could either save or destroy thousands of others. Additionally, there was the larger strategic picture. For both offensive and defensive operations, Japanese commanders in the Palau Islands had been depending on their aircraft. The balance of the entire theater changed without them. American airlines may fly nearer to the coast, offering superior close air assistance for ground forces. Without fighter resistance, reconnaissance aircraft could map Japanese positions. Without worrying about an airstrike, supply ships could make passes to the beachhead. The operational situation for the whole Plough campaign was drastically changed by a single successful strafing raid. However, Stout was also aware, with the realistic clarity of a combat veteran, that Plough would continue to be a hellhole for the Marines that arrived. The approximately 11,000-man Japanese force was buried under limestone caverns and coral ridges on the island, which served as defenses that no amount of air could penetrate. Superiority might lead to annihilation. Cave by cave and ridge by hill, the ground warfare would be brutal and among the bloodiest in the annals of the Pacific War. Although one significant threat had been eliminated by his raid, Plough remained a citadel that would have to be captured at great expense. Nevertheless, it was a significant success for every Marine who survived the landing beaches, since Japanese planes weren't strafing them. The combat maneuvers and high-speed passes had depleted his fuel supplies more quickly than he had anticipated, causing his fuel gauge to read lower than he would have wanted. He gestured to the coordinates with the Hellcats knows where the USS Hornet ought to be, and entered a calm cruise upward. The aircraft was a little tail-heavy due to the small drag caused by the hole in his tail section, but this was easily fixed with trim modifications. An agitated conversation filled the radio. The enormous smoke column rising from Plu was reported by several pilots. Controllers of the carriers want to know what was going on. The fleet is becoming confused and alarmed. With his microphone keyed, Stout gave his most subdued after-action report to date. Hornet Control. It's Stout. The mission is finished. Plu Airfield. Neutralized. Going back to the base. After a few seconds of silence, the controller finally spoke, his tone tactfully formal but unable to conceal his shock. Repeat your final words. Stout. Neutralized, did you say? Stout smiled a little to himself. Yes, the airfield isn't working anymore. To obtain documentation, you will need to scramble a picture bird. Out! 40 minutes later, Stout's Hellcat landed on the deck of the Hornet. The jolt caused his body to snap forward against the harness straps as the tail hook caught the number 3 wire. The aircraft's deck crew rushed in right away. There, when they witnessed the damage, their eyes widened. The fuselage was splattered with hydraulic fluid. The wings had scorch marks from flying through his own explosions, and the tail portion was full with shrapnel holes. After climbing up to assist Stout in leaving the cockpit, the plane's captain simply stared at him before turning to face the empty ammunition counters. As word circulated that the pilot who produced that enormous smoke column, which could be seen from 50 miles away, had just landed, the entire deck appeared to pause. A crowd had gathered by the time Stout's boots touched the deck. 3 hours were spent on the intelligence debriefing. With maps arranged on the table, Stout sat in the carrier's intelligence center and guided senior officers through each aspect of the attack, and his damage calculations were validated by picture reconnaissance birds. The story was better conveyed by the images than by the words. 40 planes were reduced to charred husks. Hours after the attack, the airstrip was still smoldering and charred, and there were still fires. As though they were still in shock that a single pilot had managed to do this, the intelligence officers continued to pose the same queries in various ways. You made how many passes? Only 2. What was the amount of ammunition you used? Everything. Were you struck? Yes, but nothing very important. Have you had any wingmen? No. Eventually, the questioning ceased, and there was a pause that felt like reverence mixed with disbelief. The Navy awarded Stout the Navy Cross for the Plu mission, the service's second. The war had progressed via more islands, invasions, and frantic battles after Stout had completed many more missions. He never discussed Plu much with other pilots, using subtle shrugs and topical shifts to sidestep inquiries. Stout's reserve stood out in the ready-room atmosphere of carrier aviation, where pilots vied to tell the best battle stories and egos ran high. Despite having done something truly remarkable, he appeared almost ashamed of the praise it received. Stout returned to civilian life in August 1945, when the war came to an end. With the same unassuming resolve that had defined his time in the military, he established a family, worked in the aerospace sector during the post-war boom, resided in California, and had an entirely normal life from the outside. Even among close friends, he seldom ever brought up his war history. Little did his kids realize that their father had served as a decorated Navy pilot. Stout's Plu mission didn't start getting the recognition it deserved until decades later, when military historians started recording the lesser-known acts of the Pacific War. His solo strike was documented by researchers looking through carrier deck records and after-action reports, and they identified it as one of the most catastrophic single-pilot attacks in the history of aviation. Although subtle, the mission had a significant impact on military theory. Stout's attack was examined by Air Force and Navy tactical schools as an example of how to take advantage of enemy errors and comprehend subsequent repercussions. The foundation of ground attack strategy was the idea that concentrated enemy assets should be attacked in order to cause cascade failures. Even outside the parameters of his initial directives, his readiness to take decisive action when given a brief opportunity became an example of the kind of initiative that officers in contemporary militaries are encouraged to develop. The operation demonstrated that one pilot with talent, bravery, and a little bit of luck might alter the outcome of conflict in the correct situation. Having survived the end of the Cold War and the adoption of the military strategies he had helped develop as regular practice, Stout died in 1989 at the age of 73. His Navy service was acknowledged in his obituary in the local newspaper, but was only given one paragraph. The rest of the article concentrated on his work and family. The majority of them who attended his funeral were unaware that the reserve guy they had known had once destroyed a whole enemy aviation base over a forgotten Pacific island in 8 minutes of bloodshed. However, the Marines who landed on the beaches of Peleliu on September 15, 1944, were spared from being destroyed by dive bombers and torpedo bombers. One pilot's choice in the final seconds before he sent his Hellcat into a dive and started shooting at 40 stationary targets was the reason they survived. The legacy that counts is that, the one measured by the thousands of men who returned home as a result of Robert Cowboy's stout decision, that some chances only come around once, and that some risks are worthwhile, rather than by medals or citations.